conversations. Let's have real conversations.
Get ready to stir it up.
Life events and everything in between. Let's go.
Get ready to stir it up.
No capping. If guests got you covered right up.
Get ready to stir it up. Stir it up.
Come on.
Get ready to stir it up.
Hello, welcome to another edition of Stir It Up. Today my guest is Dr. Carol Matthias O'Shea. She's a psychologist and someone I've known for a couple of years. And today we're going to be talking about defense mechanisms. Thank you for coming, Carol.
Thank you for having me. Excited.
So I always talk about how I drag people here kicking and screaming. And so we kind of rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how much screaming you did to come and have this conversation.
0.
0. So yes,
I think
I'm not doing too bad.
You literally sent me a message, and I literally said,
Yes.
"Let's do it."
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
So just kicking into it, I think we all have that friend who doesn't talk about their problems or pretends like they don't exist. Mm-hmm. We know someone who is in a difficult situation and sometimes has a completely different view of what that reality is. And I've come to learn that those are ways that people manage the way they feel or how they react to things. So it'd be good for you to kind of tell us, like from a pro perspective and the way we understand what defense mechanisms are. And,
I'm glad you started by, talking about the friend that we all have, because I think it's something that we can all relate to and something that we all do ourselves, right? Defense mechanisms are essentially our egos trying to protect us when we're in distressful situations, right? So when something difficult happens, when something distressful or uncomfortable, or we are feeling unpleasant emotions, there are ways in which our ego tries to protect us from fully feeling those things. And so we kind of unconsciously and automatically go into different modes as ways to try and protect ourselves from whatever it is that we are trying not to feel, right? So it's a form of protection against distress.
So if I was having a bad situation at work, but I kept on giving a reason why I was having a bad situation at work, would that be me or me saying that, oh, this is why it's this way, or saying it's my fault or someone's fault, or trying to kind of put some sense to it? Would that be me having some kind of a defense mechanism?
Not fully. That sounds like justification, which is a kind of defense mechanism. But naturally, our brains need to be able to give meaning and reasons to things. Our brains don't do really well when something happens and we can't kind of put a reason to it. So we are very intentional about, in an unconscious way, we are very intentional about searching for a reason and being able to place the blame. This is why
this is happening. Okay, very, very clear. So I've heard coping mechanisms, defense mechanisms.
Right.
Today we're talking about defense mechanisms, but it would be good to get a broad understanding of what are the differences.
Okay.
And maybe an example of a coping mechanism before we kind of go a bit deeper into the conversation around defense mechanisms.
Okay, I think it's a good distinction to try and make, because I think people use them interchangeably. But defense mechanisms are unconscious and almost automatic. So we describe them as very reactive, right? It happens without you even being aware of it. Whereas a coping mechanism is more responsive. It's a little bit more thought out. We like to think of coping mechanisms as things that you're aware of and intentionally doing to help you deal with distress. They are similar in that both of them are used in response to distressful situations. Right? Whenever we're in distress or we are sad or we're uncomfortable, it's either a coping mechanism or a defense mechanism. They both aim to do the same thing. And they're similar also along the lines of they both kind of aim at taking you from a point where you're feeling distress to a safe place, whether it's a false sense of safety or real safety. The goal is safety. But with a defense mechanism, we're often unconscious, we're not conscious of it. And with coping mechanisms, we're a little bit more aware that we are doing them. So I'm sure we'll talk about the different kinds of defense mechanism, but a coping mechanism, for example, might be alcohol or some kind of substance that you use to kind of cope and numb so that you don't deal with the situation, but you're aware that you're doing it, right? Whereas with a defense mechanism, you're not aware.
So a defense mechanism is in your subconscious, or it's something that you begin to do that others might see you do it, but you yourself don't actually realize you're doing that a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Whereas a coping mechanism might be both in your mind, but at the same time might have a physical or manifestation of it. Would that be close enough?
Yeah, coping mechanisms are more tangible.
Okay,
right?
tangible.
Tangible things that you do and people can see you doing, people can describe. Whereas a defense mechanism is a little bit more tricky. It's a little harder to place, but typically people can see the defense mechanisms, but you have a really hard time identifying and even accepting
that's how you respond to situations.
Exactly.
Okay, let's go into it. So I know there are many, so like 10 or however many.
There are a lot.
And because we don't have copious amounts of time, maybe let's walk through the 5 top defense mechanisms you experience with your clients. I'm sure that some of them are more recurring in a lot of us as humans. So let's go for it.
I think culturally, one of the ones that's very present here in Ghana is humor. People don't realize humor is a defense mechanism that I find a lot of people use to not deal with stuff, right? And the idea behind humor being a defense mechanism is that you take a serious situation, if you make light of it, then you kind of don't feel the impact of it as much. And we make fun of we'll turn literally everything and anything into a joke.
The whole nation is coping.
Humor is getting us through. We will make fun of everything. But you see the thing, and let me backtrack a bit. The thing about defense mechanisms is they are not inherently bad, right? Because they come from a place of trying to protect you. It's when you don't have an awareness of it, when there's no balance, when you're using them all the time to avoid situations, and it's like it becomes a constant part of you, that's when it's a problem, right? So there's nothing wrong with using humor to lighten a situation every once in a while. But when it becomes the thing you're going to all the time in order to not deal with stuff, then we'll say, okay, that's not great. So I think humor is one of the ones I definitely see a lot of here in Ghana.
And if you're to translate humor into one of the scientific names of the defense mechanisms, which one would that be?
We call it humor.
You call it humor?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
all right.
We'll say humor.
Interesting.
Denial is another big one. And, like the meaning of the word denial is just this idea that I'm not going to deal with the facts and the reality of a matter because it's too difficult, or it's too hard, or it doesn't feel good. So I'll pretend, not that I'm intentionally being fake or not authentic, but I will literally pretend as though something is when it isn't, or I'll pretend as though something isn't when it is, in order for me not to deal with that. And people who tend to use denial as a defense mechanism typically have grown up in homes where emotions or difficult situations were not directly addressed, right? So then and for lots of the defense mechanisms, so typically you don't know what to do or how to healthily navigate difficult emotions, so you kind of fall to these defense mechanisms, So denial is another really popular one. Projection, we all project all the time. And projection is this idea that I'm kind of misattributing something that I'm feeling to somebody else. Yes, because maybe what I'm feeling feels uncomfortable. So for example, maybe I don't like someone, right? And I feel uncomfortable admitting to myself that I don't like someone or something. And so then I'll say, or I'll start to feel as though they don't like me. Right, and so kind of like projecting onto them what you are feeling. Or a really popular one, things people find embarrassing, right? A lot of times they'll say, oh, but if I go and make a mistake, I'll be embarrassed and people will make fun of me. In situations like that, we're usually projecting. It's because we think maybe situations like that are embarrassing. So we'll kind of project onto other people and assume wrongly sometimes that people are thinking and feeling things that they might not be feeling. Right. Another really popular one is displacement. I see that a lot as well. And displacement has a lot to do with power dynamics, right? Displacement is this idea that if I'm feeling something and the person I'm feeling it towards, I don't feel as though I can express it towards the person, maybe because they have some kind of authority over me or they pose a threat in some way. And so instead of directing whatever I'm feeling towards them, I'll direct it towards somebody I feel is less threatening.
So would that be, I'm at work, I've had a really bad day, my boss is a crap boss, they've not been really pleasant to me.
Yep.
I can't lash out at my boss, so I come out and lash out at my children at
Yes, or my assistant at work, or the
my
driver,
assistant,
or
or
the
the
cleaner,
driver.
just anybody I see as less threatening. Or you see it a lot with parent-child relationships too. When a child doesn't feel as though they can lash out as a parent, they will either lash out as a younger sibling, or we see it a lot with bullies, right? When you work with bullying in school, children who tend to bully other children usually really want to lash out at their parents, but can't, and so they'll displace all that aggression and frustration onto
another child,
right? And as a way to kind of not feel, because when we feel those things, we need to do something with it. And if I can't lash out at mom, I need to lash out at somebody to get rid of it. Right?
Keep going.
We said 5, right?
I think we'll go past 5
because
we're going.
Because I'm already thinking of 2 more that I was about to say. I'll share 2 more that I see quite often. One is suppression, right? Which is this idea that if there are unpleasant feelings, thoughts, memories that I don't want to feel, I'll kind of push them down, try to forget it, not deal. Because if I do that, then it doesn't exist, right? But what people don't realize is that with emotions and memories, they don't go anywhere, right? If you suppress, if you behave as though they're not there, they are there. You just aren't acknowledging them. And then when you don't, because they are there, they come out in other ways. And so we also say that passive aggressiveness is a defense mechanism. It's an offshoot of suppression. So sometimes it'll be referred to as a defense mechanism when you're passively aggressive, because the idea is that you have all these suppressed emotions that have to find a way out. And so they'll come out in very passively aggressive kind of situations. Another one that's also really popular is avoidance. Right, just avoid everything. However it is you do it. If it doesn't feel good, if it puts you in distress, avoid either by distracting, not talking about it, behaving as though it's not there, diverting conversations, just anything to avoid what the reality of a situation is.
So right. I see quite a few close similarities between denial, suppression, and avoidance, because they're all creating some form of illusion or alternative world, right?
Yeah, to what the reality is.
Alternative, kind of distorting what the reality of things are. Children. You find that kids will learn ways to defend themselves, right? So they get these defense mechanisms as a response to what's happening in their environment. Right. And they will carry it on through their lives. But I'm trying to work out if as adults, we also develop new defense mechanisms as we go along.
Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Okay. And I'll go back a bit to explain. We say we kind of don't know where defense mechanisms come from. We just know that they come from our ego trying to protect us, right? And so with children as well, we need to understand that ego development is still happening, right? And so there's this idea that the ego kind of tries out different defense mechanisms in childhood for fit, and then what usually determines what a child kind of holds on to is what they also see their primary caregivers doing, right? So a lot of times parents are also modeling certain defense mechanisms for children and they're not aware of it. So if a child sees mommy sort of like constantly project or displace, they don't understand that that's what's happening, but they kind of adopt it, right? And then whatever those coping defense mechanisms are, they kind of grow up with it, and the more they have experiences, use a defense mechanism, it seems to work the more comfortable it feels, right? So over time, defense mechanisms actually become more, cemented. So it rarely changes. But people do have experiences where you have a particular experience and the defense mechanism doesn't work well. Yeah. So the idea there is that your ego will go searching for something else. Right? And so there are experiences that lead to adults changing their defense mechanism. And there even are some people, had experiences where, depending on the situation, they'll use a different defense mechanism, or depending on who they're dealing with.
So just so that this is a bit more tangible for people, and I will put a caveat in there, this is not a prescription or a diagnosis, but if you could share a few situations and the associated defense mechanisms that could emerge. So for example, if you lived in a house with parents who were not present, how would you cope? If you lived in a house where you felt you couldn't speak up or couldn't be heard, or if you lived in a house where you felt like you had to fend for yourself, i.e. almost raise yourself, or if you were in a house where your parents were overly liberal, what does that mean? Or if you were in a place where you had everything you needed, because it's not just negative things that I don't think it's just negative things that birth defense mechanisms, right? It's the environment you live in and how you try and navigate that environment. So sometimes a child might have so much, and that might be overwhelming for that child, because that might result in maybe some bullying at school or teasing, whatever it is. So maybe if you could give us a few examples, and then what the result could be or the defense mechanism could be, that would make it a bit more tangible for people listening to us.
So I'll start with the first one, parents that are maybe either emotionally or physically unavailable. Right, two defense mechanisms that usually arise from that, we didn't talk about them, are withdrawal and detachment. Right, this idea that when something distressful is happening, I kind of go inward, detach myself from everything around me, and try and deal with it on my own. Because I grew up in an environment where I had to, right? Because there was nobody available to help me navigate difficult situations. The example you gave about, or let's take a home where maybe, and this happens a lot, and I think within our culture, where children's emotions are invalidated and belittled, right? So a child is upset about something and crying, and one of the first things we'll say is, stop crying. Stop, without even asking,
why are you crying?
Maybe we'll get to that later, but the first thing is stop crying. Oh, if it's a boy, boys don't cry. Oh, are you a baby? So belittling their emotions. Something like that can lead to, most of them, denial, right? Suppression, because the message the child is getting is that what I'm feeling is not important. It's not real, and it's not important. Exactly. So let me learn how to kind of not feel those things, or not acknowledge that I'm feeling those things, because here's the thing that parents need to understand. Children look to them for everything, not just physical needs, but also look to them to get a sense of, okay, when I feel this, what am I supposed to do? Depending on how mommy and daddy react when I do this, okay, this is the go ahead to feel my feelings or not, right? A child who grows up with parents who maybe are overly attentive, right, too present, which can be a bad thing, right?
We think it's a good thing.
It's a good thing, but
yes, because you're not letting them learn to make mistakes and recover.
Exactly. A defense mechanism, avoidance, right, because of a lack of accountability. Children who have overly present parents don't know how to be accountable for anything, because mom is always there, dad is always there covering them, right? So there isn't that balance, like you're saying, of learning to be independent of mom and dad and deal with certain things. So avoidance, you see projection, you see displacement, right?
So everything is not my fault. It's your fault.
Yes, it's coming from somebody else. Exactly. Because mom and dad have created an environment where I can do no wrong. Everything I have, I need. Maybe I'm not corrected. Maybe I'm not held accountable for my mistakes and the things that I do wrong. Let's take a home where there's a lot of conflict, for example. So a child who grows up seeing mom and dad go at it all the time, and not in a healthy way, right? Once again, a child like that may develop withdrawal. So like, let me get away from all of this chaos, right? Or passive, they might also be passively aggressive because they are feeling all these things. They are experiencing all these things, chaos, anxiety.
Because they've suppressed so much.
Exactly.
They got it.
Then they kind of go out and
lash out
to other people as well. So the environment in the home is super important. And generally, you can link all defense mechanisms to whether or not a child grows up in an environment where it's safe for them to figure out their emotions, right? Because children, as they develop, and in this culture, it's interesting because we're very much interested and aware and on top of a child's physical development, right? Because that you can see. If a child isn't eating and not growing well, you can very quickly see that.
Academic development.
Academic, cognitive, we are big on that. School, you need to do well in school. Are you first? All of that. But what we are not doing a great job with is emotional development, right? Because essentially, as a child is developing their relationship with their emotions, there should be a safe enough environment where they can figure it out, right? Where they know that, okay, if I feel angry, I have some guidance in navigating that anger. If I feel sad, which doesn't feel good, there's some guidance around, okay, it's okay to feel sad, but maybe this is how you need to
think about
it or deal with it. Because, like I said, the defense mechanisms are not a bad thing. They are meeting one of our most basic needs as human beings, which is the need for safety, right? When those defense mechanisms come up, they are trying to put us in the place where we feel safe.
So this is a huge teaching moment for me as a parent. I remember reading something around how by the time a child is like 8 or 10, a lot of things are kind of coded into their minds. And it's quite daunting to think that as a parent, you're responsible, you are significantly responsible for how a child learns to cope and adapt to situations, and they're mimicking your very flawed behaviors.
Yeah.
So when a defense mechanism no longer serves you, but you've been doing it for 30 years, and now you're married to this beautiful woman who has a nice smile and is humble, and you have a friend called Awo who says that, she's really nice and she's a really lovely person. But you have a certain defense mechanism.
Yeah.
And that won't serve you in your relationship. What's the first step to finding your way?
That's a big question. The first step is, and let's backtrack a bit, usually the hardest things around defense mechanisms is identifying and that awareness and that acceptance, because that's the first big step. You need to identify and acknowledge that something is a problem before we can even sort of figure out how you go about it. So I encourage people to pay attention to the feedback people give them. If you are getting consistent feedback from different people that, you are defensive, it's like you avoid, it's like you deny. If you keep hearing the same things over and over and over and over from several people, you need to pay attention, right? Because that's usually an indication that they are seeing something that you don't see.
And it's okay that you don't see it because
it's unconscious.
It's unconscious.
Right? So the people on the receiving end, they are more likely to see it, and they are more likely to be less defensive about seeing it because it's not them. So if you're getting that consistent feedback, listen, right? And if therapy is an option for you, therapy is a great place to go to identify those defense mechanisms and to try and figure out what the root of it is for you, right? Because you and I, for example, may have the same defense mechanism, but may have developed it for very different reasons, right? So it's important that you figure out what the root of it is for you. Those are the first two most important steps: acknowledging and then being able to figure out what the root of it is. Changing the behavior, as you know, takes time. Right? Because like you said, if you've been doing this for 30 plus years, your brain, even if it's not great for you, your brain knows it's familiar, so it feels safe. And our brains, the reason why human beings struggle with change so much is our brains literally receive change as danger, right? Because there's safety in familiarity. And so when you take away something familiar and you're trying to introduce something new to the brain, it's literally like, whoa, what's going on here? It's uncomfortable.
It's scary.
It's scary. And our brain's number one job is to preserve us, protect us, right? So that change is difficult. But I've worked with and seen a lot of people take that awareness, that growing awareness of why they have the defense mechanisms they have, what things trigger those defense mechanisms. That's also important to know. And take all that awareness, add that to small actionable steps that you can start to take to try to teach yourself how to respond differently. One of the things that we'll say is really helpful is for you to then intentionally learn certain coping mechanisms that are healthy for you, right? Because the idea there is defense mechanisms are unconscious. You kind of don't know when you're doing it. But if you start to focus on it, you start to notice, the triggers, okay, if this person says this I'm likely to. So instead of doing that, let me intentionally implement my coping mechanism, right?
So one of the things I do is I make sense of everything. So I would say I rationalize. So if someone works for me and they do A, B, C, D, I will sit down and I would look at it from their perspective, I look at it from my perspective. And I've been reliably informed that it's a defense mechanism.
It is.
What I find is in rationalizing things, I normally put my needs and my feelings second. What does that mean? Is that normal? What does that mean? Because when I rationalize, I'm normally rationalizing to justify other people's behavior, not necessarily my actions. And yeah.
But you're justifying other people's behavior in order for it not to mean something to you.
For it to affect me or for it to impact me.
Exactly.
Got it.
So if I can rationalize that somebody that I was depending on didn't show up for me, if I can rationalize that, okay, they had a lot going on, they had to do this, then I protect myself against the disappointment that I'm feeling. Right.
Or they're selfish and that's how they are. So you know what? Suck it up.
But that still protects you from they did something to me, right? So in doing that, you are kind of putting your needs and your emotions secondary to theirs,
Yes.
right?
But in reality, it is protecting me.
It is, but it's a false sense of protection.
Yeah, because
Right.
even though I've made those justifications, they just might be that justifications, but not necessarily always the reality.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So I'm sensing that a lot of defense mechanisms are also built in falsehood.
Yes, a lot of falsehood. The whole idea is for you not to deal with reality. So it's like it gives you a distorted sense of what is actually going on. So in that distortion, there's quite a bit of falsehood, right? But like I said earlier on, it's not all bad, because there are some things that, let me give this example. People who experience traumatic events, massively traumatic events, we need their defense mechanisms to kick in so that they don't completely break down, right? So if you've experienced something horribly traumatic, your brain and your ego will literally distort it in a way to protect you, right? We see that a lot with victims of horrible forms of abuse, where their minds will literally suppress the memories to the point where they cannot remember, right? As a way to protect them against the impact
So they
of
really can't remember
They can't remember. There's a direct link between trauma and our memory. Part of your memory will literally shut down to keep you from remembering traumatic events, because then the pain and the impact of that trauma is too much for the brain to bear at that point, right? So in that sense, we'll say that's a good thing, and that's an indication that your brain is doing its job, right? As a way to sort of defend and help you cope. And sometimes, and that's why when people go into shock, maybe when somebody hears really, really bad news, sometimes they will that state of shock will have them almost behaving irrationally or denial, because denial is one of the very first things people deal with when they are dealing with grief, right? And it's to protect you, from the shock of that really bad news. So your brain will retreat into a place where no, that actually hasn't happened, right? So like I said, it's not bad. It's not a bad thing. It's just when it becomes your MO all the time, right? Where you're constantly, because you cannot go through life like that all the time.
Because it affects everything.
It
affects
everything.
Your work,
everything.
Your relationships,
everything.
The way people see you. You can't build trust.
Exactly.
All of those kinds of thoughts.
Exactly.
So I want to give you 2 scenarios.
Okay.
And tell me what the possible, and we've done a bit of this already, but I'm doing this so that we talk about what the possible defense mechanism is and how that influences a future relationship.
Okay.
So imagine a child who has lived in a home where they felt like they didn't belong.
Okay.
Right. So you have 6 siblings, 7 siblings. You're probably very different, you know, or the youngest of the siblings, or, you know, or it could be anything, or you could be a stepchild, whatever it is. But you felt like in that space you didn't belong. So let's say you developed one of the defense mechanisms that we've talked about, whether it's regression, whether it's suppression or feeling displaced, whatever it is. So maybe you tell us what you then do to defend yourself, what you could be doing to defend yourself. How does that show up when you are 30 and married, as a man or as a woman?
It can show up in 2 ways.
Okay.
Because you felt as though you didn't belong, maybe not belonging, you felt as though you weren't seen, you weren't heard, your voice didn't matter. People like that tend to show up in intimate relationships in one of 2 ways. They have a need, a deep need, strong need to be heard, right? So in a relationship, you might show up as overly vocal, overly defensive. I have to be heard. My voice cannot be silenced anymore. You will see me, you will feel me, you will know that I'm
by
here.
Force or by fire? That's what Jada says. By force or by fire,
exactly.
You hear me.
Because it's driven by that need of, in this intimate situation again, I will not be silenced. I will not be the fly on the wall. You will see me, you will hear me. So they might be overly, in terms of conflict, they might be overly aggressive. They might be... They might be the kind of people who make, you know, mountains out of molehills, right? Because their fear is that every little thing has to be addressed. Otherwise, the fear is that it won't be. And once again, my needs will be
squashed and under the carpet, swept under the carpet.
So they'll either show up like that, or they'll show up as, once again, withdrawing, right? Because, well, nobody sees me anyways. I'm not worth being seen. I'm not worth being heard. I don't belong. So then in a conflict situation with a partner, for example, they will shut down, right, and withdraw and not engage at all. So it can show up in one of two ways.
It's interesting because a lot of the time we don't realize that we carry all the things that we have in our adulthood. We've been dragging them along like a cart our whole lives. So second scenario. Imagine a man who has, to the visibility of his kids, for example, multiple relationships, or a woman who has several issues of infidelity, and her kids can see that, right? And the kids can also see the pain of the other partner, be it the man or the woman, and what they are going through. So it could be a man who's not providing in his home, and how the mother deals with that, right? How do these kids? Because we've all seen at different points in time that 9-year-old who's now doing connections when they're 30, that, oh, that's what daddy was doing, or that's what Uncle Bob, that's who Uncle Bob was, right?
Yeah.
Where do they come from? How are they coping when they're children? And how does that show up as adults?
The situation you are describing, we would describe as one that's very emotionally chaotic, right? And children respond to chaos in a bunch of different ways. Denial is one of them. But then there's also, for when it involves parents, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance coming from the fact that I love dad, I love mom, but I can either see that dad is doing stuff that's constantly hurting mom, or mom is doing stuff that is constantly hurting dad. So I'm torn between two worlds, right? So this place of just constant chaos, of feeling as though I have to come down on one side, but I can't because
Kids love both parents.
Kids love both parents, and it's a very difficult thing for them to do. So a lot of kids in those situations go, denial is a very popular one, and then suppression, which comes out in a lot of passive aggressiveness, because there's a lot of chaos and they don't know what to do with it. And whenever we're dealing with difficult emotions, I ask people to think about, even as adults, when we experience confusing big emotions, is difficult for us. A lot of times we think kids' feelings are smaller, but kids experience emotions
Are magnified
or even the same way as we do. So I tell an adult, you as a grown woman, you have difficulty dealing with hurt.
Yes.
Imagine what that's like for a 4 or 5 year old. It's just as big and it's just as confusing, because they don't even have the tools. They don't have the language to even know a lot of times what's happening. So somebody who grows up in a home like that might become an adult who is emotionally unavailable, for example, because
and so it's or a runner,
right? Commitment, because they've seen the kind of pain and chaos that can result from that, right? From being emotionally available, from being connected, they don't want to do any of that. Or a child, it might affect their relationship with honesty and truth. I'll give an example. There was a situation with a couple, not that I worked with, that I heard of, where there was some infidelity involved. And the young man, it came down to the fact that he didn't believe that honesty was necessary. Truth wasn't a thing that was a value to him, because he saw his father blatantly kind of just be very deceptive and not honest. So that shaped his relationship in terms of what the truth is. And they eventually had a conversation where they realized, okay, truth and honesty isn't something that he valued.
Yeah.
Right.
So on the list of values, it was like number 56.
So to him, because his partner would get really like, don't you see that what you're doing is wrong? And he really honestly didn't see that he was doing anything wrong, because to him, being dishonest isn't something that he valued, right? So like you're saying, these things can follow us into adulthood and show up in ways that we sometimes cannot always make the dots immediately. It requires a certain level of deep reflection and being willing to open boxes that we often do not want to open, and hold the mirror up to our faces and kind of ask ourselves some hard questions.
You know, I'm a very big proponent of, or I'm a very big believer in therapy. I've been through my own very fair share of therapists. Some I will not comment about. Culturally, we don't believe in therapy.
Right.
But as I hear you talk, I do think that it's important for us to even unlock ourselves. Yes, we need to be attentive to what people say to us, but sometimes that doesn't really mean much to us, right? I'm even beginning to think that, is there more we can do to get people to understand that the brain is a machine, and there are technicians that are trained and skilled to help service that brain the way we service our cars every month. And I'm not asking that we service our brains every month, but when you do feel something, or you're struggling to navigate something, that it's okay to talk to someone who actually knows what they're doing. Because my takeaway from this is, with defense mechanisms, they serve you, but at a point in time, they no longer serve you. And you might need some support or a willingness to be vulnerable, to even acknowledge and then work through those things.
Yeah.
How do we get ourselves to a place culturally? And this is where I'll end this conversation.
Okay.
Where
That's a big
we are
question.
open
Yeah.
a lot more
Yeah.
to having these kinds of conversations.
Well, the first thing is to keep having these kinds of conversations, right? Because I think, and culturally, there's a reason why the idea of sort of like formal professional therapy hasn't been a thing, because, traditionally we kind of believe that the things that therapy does kind of like are inbuilt into a lot of the ways in which we traditionally did life, right? Where we had a lot of communal living, right? And there were elders and, people that you could talk to about things, right? What we don't realize is that we've moved away from that quite a bit, and we don't have those support structures in place as much anymore.
Those support structures, in my opinion, are flawed. Because when I struggled, for example, in my relationship, and I tried to get support from those kinds of support structures, the advice was always from a place of their experience,
Right.
which was not necessarily always a reflection of my reality all the time, isn't it? So I agree with you that there's the communal living and there are all those support structures that existed, but a part of me also feels like times are changing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And mental health is a bigger thing today than it was even 10 years ago.
Yep. But it is rooted, that's one of the things that is rooted in terms of, we don't need it.
Yeah.
It's not a part of our culture. There is a shift, though, to be fair. I think for us to have a fair conversation, there is a shift. There's a shift happening with the younger generations, the Gen Zs, the millennials. There's a shift that has been gradually happening in terms of their understanding. No, like you said, I need to go and sit down with somebody who has been trained in this to help me figure this out. So that is taking away a lot of the shame. When you talk to younger people, the shame and the stigma and the mystery around therapy isn't there as much. But the reality is we still have a long way to go. And I think one of the things that we need to do is to kind of bring it out from under the shadows, out of the dark, talk about it. Because I think one of the main things that doesn't help is a lack of understanding. This idea that if you're going to therapy, then you're crazy. And this idea that crazy, we literally associate crazy with the naked people we see on the streets. But so it's our understanding, and there's a lot of ignorance around it. So the conversations are quite important, because I think you normalize things the more you talk about it, right? So we get to the point where, as easy as it is for you to tell a colleague, I didn't come into work today because I had a really bad headache. We get to the point where we can say, I didn't come into work today because I felt really, really low, right? And it isn't received with any kind of
way,
right? So I think as individuals, I encourage people to think about what can you do in the communities that you belong to, right? What can you do in terms of what kinds of conversations are being had about mental health and therapy? What kind of reactions are we getting when people talk about mental? Because I think we have a responsibility to each other, right? Because one of the reasons why it also remains a bit of a stigma is how people are received, either when they struggle or when they open up, right? And so that, and then I also think more people who are in therapy need to talk about it, right? So it isn't like a hidden thing that only some people do. But the reality also is it's expensive. So there's an issue of accessibility. The reality is our mental health or our healthcare system in this country doesn't
support it. Even insurance companies will put on psychotherapy or psychiatry on the list of services offered.
Yeah.
So, because I had to, for example, insist my insurance provider for my teams would put on therapy.
Yeah.
And that's because we've just been through the pandemic. I had a whole bunch of kids who were struggling with different things.
Yeah.
And they needed somewhere to be able to have those conversations, you know. Yeah. And thankfully we have, is it the ERP, Employee Assistance, EAP system that allows people to, you know, reach out to therapists online or by a phone call to help engage them.
But not a lot of people have that kind of access.
That's
right?
absolutely
The
right.
majority of, so even in terms of our public healthcare system, doesn't really accommodate for that. So you either have the money to pay for it or then you don't, right? So accessibility is also a big issue. And I think as a country, until we get to the point where we do prioritize it, we are going to kind of be marking time in the same place. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sure we're way over our time because I can see the two people that looking at us. I've deliberately avoided eye contact completely. It's been really great talking to you.
It has been.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
So the fun part of this, which is cocktails.
Yay.
I've been good not to make an alcoholic cocktail for you.
Thank you.
And the rule is you're going to try it and then
Okay.
you're going to tell me what's in it.
Okay. All right.
So let's see.
Let's go.
Let's go.
Okay, does it have some kind of mixed fruity
No mixed fruit, nothing.
orange?
Orange, yes.
Okay.
So she got orange. That's what I was going to say. You would taste the orange. Let's see if you pick something else.
Is there grenadine in here?
There's no grenadine
There's no
in
grenadine.
there. But you did well. You got orange.
Okay.
There is a fizzy drink in
Okay,
there.
a fizzy drink. Okay. That's what I meant by Yay! Do I get a prize?
No, you don't get a prize. I wish. You know, we need to start giving prizes, don't you think so?